seeing you.
Author Lindsay Gary felt a need to highlight the beauty and richness of multiple spots around Houston that would be historically significant within Black communities of the region. But what she discovered was that some of those sites simply disappeared.
When I launched the book, I talked about the indigenous presence. I mean, there were people here for thousands of years before anybody else came. We don't have very much documentation of those groups. Many people in Houston can't even tell you who they were.
I'm Eddie Robinson. Stay tuned as we go on a journey with historian and genealogist Dr. Lindsay Gary. She chats about her new guidebook called The New Red Book, a guide to 50 of Houston's Black historical and cultural sites. What led her to this project? And what challenges did she encounter while writing this book? Oh yeah, I feel you. We hear you. I see you. It's I See You. I'm Eddie Robinson, and we're so grateful to have with us author, historian, Africologist, and professor scholar, Dr. Lindsay Gary. Lindsay, thank you so much for being a guest on I See You.
Thank you so much, and it feels good to be called doctor.
Yes, congratulations. I believe that just happened maybe sort of like 2 minutes ago.
Yes, literally yesterday. So I'm thankful, and I'm happy to be here.
So this book is called The New Red Book, and I think there are those out there, Lindsay, who may not be aware of the original Red Book. Tell us more about the original Red Book and how it inspired or perhaps even played a role in how you'd go about constructing The New Red Book.
Yes, I appreciate that question. So actually, when I started working on this project, I had no idea about the Red Book. I didn't know what that was at all. So I started writing this book maybe in 2019. And this is when I first started my PhD program, and I was in Philadelphia. I'm a big Houston, big Southern girl. And, I remember telling all my cohort mates about how amazing Houston is. Y'all got to come visit, come see. And then I realized there was really no place for me to direct them. Like, okay, these are the things to do in Houston that are geared around like the Black community. And so I decided to create a longer list of an article I had actually written earlier that year. And I'm realizing, okay, the article I wrote was not enough. And we have so many more sites. And so I started just making a list of all the historical and cultural sites. And that was probably in like September of 2019. So it actually wasn't until I was actually writing the book itself. I had already, been working with the printing museum, the amazing publisher. And actually toward the end, so it was actually probably mid-2021 when I was almost done writing the book that I came across the Red Book. So it was in my research. And it really was just a form of affirmation, a form of confirmation for me that I was on the right track. I had no idea. And I'm like, I know all this stuff about Houston and don't know about the Red Book. And it really inspired me to create the new name. So originally I had a working title, something like, The Guide to Black Houston, something really basic. And I never liked the title, but I was like a working title. And then when I saw the Red Book, I said, okay, that's it. It's going to be the new Red Book.
Wow. Now, people may also be familiar with the Green Book, all these colors. And the Green Book, which, I actually went from, I wasn't familiar with the Red Book or the Green Book, but the movie really captured my interest. Back in 2018, the movie loosely based, inspired by the true story of an African-American classical pianist and his Italian-American driver and bodyguard, both on tour venues through the Deep South in the 1960s.
I am not a medical doctor. I'm a musician. I'm about to embark on a concert tour in the Deep South. What other experience do you have? Public relations. Do you foresee any issues?
That movie was named after the infamous Green Book, which served as a guidebook for Black travelers. And it was published by Victor Hugo Green from 1936 to 1966. Interestingly enough, with your new Red Book, I'm wondering, as you were compiling it all together, why do you think there's been this, or appears to be, a struggle or a sense of conflict to try and preserve Black history, the Black experiences of the city of Houston. I still can't believe that, but for the fact that it had not been for the construction of a new public school institution in Sugar Land, we would not have known about the inexplicable system of modern day slavery that went on during convict leasing. We had civic engagement leader Chastity Alaude, who's part of Fort Bend ISD. You know her. Fantastic. We call her the social studies superhero.
I like to give people a 360-degree tour of Sugar Land in 5 minutes. And they say, how are you going to do that?
She was mentioning to us that, this excavation was done on public land, public property. And if a private company or organization would have done construction there, we wouldn't have known, what transpired back in 1867.
Investigation, a guard actually says, never known to call a family, just bury them in a pine box made by the prisoners, right? And so not only do we have the historical wondering of, did people even know that their family members were arrested and sent here? But then they also didn't know that they died. And the cemetery was unmarked.
So my question to you is, why do you think that it's been such a struggle, or it appears to be a struggle, to find out or to see more of Houston's history without having to know what you're looking for or what to ask for? You don't know what you don't know, right? But what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think, first of all, Chastity's amazing. Her people are also from where my people are from. So we talk all the time.
That's right.
Yes.
In Louisiana.
Yes. Literally all the time. I love her and her work and everything she's doing, and all the other people who contributed to preserving that history there in Sugar Land. Actually, I think you really alluded to what the issue is. It really boils down to racism and the erasure of the history of African Americans in this city, but also the history of racism in this city. Because if you look at the Sugar Land 95 site, for example, no one really wants us to know, the world of the present, to know what happened there. And because they would have to be held accountable for all those people who were abused. And you don't have to go to the so-called Deep South to see that. It's right in our backyards. It's in what we call the suburbs, these areas with the beautiful homes and the well-manicured lawns. And then right next door, it's like this place of immense suffering that happened for decades. And so I think that it's very intentional to hide that history, unfortunately. Now, the other sites where it's something more positive happening, I think it kind of has the same there's the same element of wanting to minimize maybe the contributions of Black people to this city. And so, unfortunately, many sites have been lost. And the purpose of this book, one of the purposes, is to not only teach people about the sites that are still in existence, but also encourage tourism to those sites, support, so that they don't have to go through this situation where they're no longer existing for whatever reason. I want people to know about them and not have to know the people to tell them about the thing and know, oh, okay, that place I pass every day is something. You already have it at your hands. This is something,
Right. And there's evidence.
Yes, documentation.
Yes. It's I See You. I'm Eddie Robinson, and we're speaking in studio with author, historian, professor scholar, Dr. Lindsay Gary. She has a new book out called The New Red Book, an interesting guidebook that puts a spotlight on 50 of Houston's Black historical and cultural sites of the region. The title of the book pays tribute to the original 1915 publication, The Red Book of Houston. Dr. Gary, how did you go about doing your research? I mean, the process of mapping out, which areas you definitely wanted to pursue, which areas you felt like, I might not get any kind of cooperation or assistance in really learning more about this particular site. How did you conduct the research going into it?
So that's a good question. So when I first started, I initially just started with what I knew already, just from living here. My family, my grandparents are from Louisiana, but my mom grew up in Houston. And then my dad has been living here for a while. And so just our immediate family and friends, a lot of these sites I grew up going to too. So I really utilized my own knowledge initially. And I'm also a historian, so some of the things I acquired later, of course. From there, where that was, limiting, then I decided to talk to people in the community. So I did interviews. And so I reached out to the sites, asked them more information about each location, just other people that I knew in the community to give that information. And I also reached out to certain historians in the city, such as our editor, Deborah Blacklock Sloan, who helped me as well. She's been doing a lot of community activism for years. And so that was how I did the research. And I couldn't choose everything. Yeah. We couldn't include everything, but we included as much as we could.
Yeah, and I wanted to get into, there being only 50 sites that you highlighted in this book. Were there any parts of the city or regions that were left out?
So when I first embarked on this journey, and it really has been a journey, I included a lot of restaurants and just general businesses. And fortunately, there are many Black-owned businesses. And I'm like, ooh, I don't think I got the time to.
Interesting.
Yeah, we have a lot of Black-owned businesses, which is great.
Yes.
But I really wanted to focus more on the sites that have been around for a long time. Not all of them have been around for decades, but I focused primarily on those sites and really wanted to look at historical and cultural institutions. So not necessarily just a general Black-owned business, but really ones that have been pillars in the Black community and continue to be pillars. It's comprehensive to a certain extent, but it's not exhaustive. And really time limitations as well played a role.
Sure. There you go. The book came to life with the support of the Artist in Residence program at the Printing Museum, which you mentioned earlier, which is also the publisher. Can you share with our audience more about what this program is all about? How did you learn about that?
So I believe I was on their email list. So ask me how I got on the list. But I was getting emails. I probably subscribed at some point. And they had an opportunity for the Artist in Residence. I applied. And it was with this idea to create this book. And so I didn't get it. But, I was a little disappointed. But I was like, okay, I got an email from the director saying, we really liked this. Unfortunately, we didn't have the capacity to see it through. And, I just thought that was like a general email. I'm like, okay, whatever. Keep moving.
Yeah.
So then I got another email that was reiterating that, but in more detail. And he was saying, we really liked it. And we really want to see this through, but we want you to reapply the next round after you've done more of the interviews so that we have the capacity to see it through within the time frame of the residency, which was only about a few months. So then I applied again, like the next few months, and they're like, actually, same issue. We don't have the capacity.
I bet you wanted to just jump out the window.
No, but see, no, not really. Only because they said we didn't have the capacity, but it was the but.
Okay.
It was the but. We are creating a separate program just for you to complete this project because we really do love it.
Wow.
And it's called a writer in residence.
Wow.
And I was the very first writer in residence for the Printing Museum for this book.
That's fantastic.
I mean, it's a dream come true.
And it seemed to have been like a fate sort of process that you had to do this.
Yeah, they believed in it, and I'm always going to be appreciative of that.
With the new Red Book, what were some of the challenges? What were some of the roadblocks that you had to face when you were mapping out these historically Black spaces and places around the city of Houston?
So, one issue I found was actually hearing back from people. I mean, when I was writing this was in, the midst of a pandemic.
Yes.
People were busy. And as we know, a lot of these Black sites are underfunded, understaffed. So they really didn't have the capacity sometimes to even respond to a phone call or an email, to be frank. And so it was hard to kind of get interviews at some point from some sites. To be honest, that was a major roadblock. And just in general, writing the book, just seeing it through. It's so easy to just like, okay, I'm tired of writing and rereading and revising and editing. So just really having the mental capacity to complete it and just staying focused and dedicated to the project. But the Printing Museum really helped me with that. Family and friends helped me stay focused and just remembering why I started.
Yeah.
I mean, I know it sounds cliche, but it's true. Just like, we need this book.
There you go. There you go. And it tells me that you have a strong passion for history.
Yes.
Where did that passion come from? Because, many of us don't know any of these, types of incidents that happen because they weren't taught in school.
Yes. I came here like this, apparently. That's what my parents and everybody, they're like, you came here like this.
I love that.
But they definitely, my parents and like our friends and community, other family members, they definitely cultivated that passion for me.
Yeah.
And my grandparents are very passionate about history as well. So I would literally just sit and listen to them tell family history stories and just I grew up around that kind of community. So I definitely think it was cultivated. And then I just followed through. I studied it in college, got a master's in it, so I really cultivated that passion of mine.
Coming up, we'll chat more with Dr. Lindsay Gary, author of The New Red Book. What are some of the 50 cultural sites that are featured in her guidebook? And then later, we'll get her thoughts on if school districts throughout the region might even consider bringing the New Red Book into local classrooms. I'm Eddie Robinson. Our second segment of ICU happens in just a moment. We'll be right back.
If you're enjoying this program, please be sure to subscribe to our podcast, ICU with Eddie Robinson. You can hear all the past episodes and be notified when new episodes are released. Also, please take a minute to give us a review or comment. We love getting feedback from our listeners. It's ICU. I'm your host, Eddie Robinson, and we're speaking with Dr. Lindsay Gary. We're fortunate to have her in studio, and she's written a book called The New Red Book, a guide to 50 of Houston's Black historical and cultural sites. Let's dive into some of the places, and get some insight on some of the cultural sites that were created and sustained by African Americans. Can you go about and describe your favorite site and why?
That one is always hard. The favorite site.
Oh.
Can I give you a couple?
Please.
A few, maybe. So I'll talk about the ones that come to my mind. You actually mentioned one already, which is the Sugarland 95 site. I always talk about the cemeteries, even though that's not really exciting. I guess for many people, they're so important, especially the Sugarland 95 site, but also Olivewood Cemetery, because they, to me, represent a very clear connection to Africa. The decor, the way that those burial sites are created really represent the traditional aspects of African spirituality. And I think that's very rare to see that in the present, in contemporary times. So I always encourage people to go there. But also, some of the earliest, Black founders of the city are buried in Olivewood. So I think that's a very important site. It's one of the earliest sites. That's hard. I love Project Row Houses.
Project Row Houses is a 25-year-old arts and culture organization based in Houston's Northern 3rd Ward. We're located approximately 3 blocks from Emancipation Park, a 10-acre park bought by freed slaves to celebrate their freedom. We walk on the grounds of freed slaves here every day, and that's not lost on us.
I was a docent there when I was in school at TSU. Another one of my favorites, which is TSU. So, there's so many, but I think...
TSU Tigers, that's great.
Yeah, I think... I hate to do the favorite because I love them all, but for sure, those are the ones that come to my mind first.
Yeah, and you speaking of Texas Southern, there is a history in and of itself in that site and that school.
It's not just a school.
Yes.
It's not, and for these sites are not just whatever their, category is.
Yeah.
TSU was an important place for the civil rights movement here in Houston. A lot of what we know that led to the ultimate desegregation of the city was created by the students from TSU.
Wow.
Who staged the earliest sit-ins.
Yes.
And nonviolent sit-ins.
After learning that a fellow student was unlawfully beaten by police, the courageous act of 13 Texas Southern University students set a unique path towards a relatively quiet and peaceful desegregation of Houston.
A group of students wanted to do something about it. They said, this can't go on. We can't have people treat us this way. We are just as much a citizen as anyone else. And that plan was to make that first sit-in on March 4th. 1960.
Even the post office on Alameda was one of those first sites. So there's so much history where we just don't even know, that it was there. We just pass it by. And TSU is not just a school. It's so much more.
Right.
And I'm a third generation.
Wow.
Yes.
Wow. There you go with TSU.
Yes.
Shout out to Texas Southern.
Correct.
Were there any surprises? It's like, here you are, not only a researcher, a historian, but you're also an investigator, right? Disclosing and revealing some pretty interesting and fascinating nuggets of the past that relates to African Americans here in Old City of Houston. What were some discoveries that really shocked you, Dr. Gary?
Oh, wow, Dr. Gary. So I would say, I would definitely say the Red Book. That was the first surprise. Like, what?
Yes.
I had
the actual publication of the Red Book.
Correct. I had no idea. I had no idea about that. I would say I had a surprise actually when I was working on the book, before I was working with the Printing Museum. I was commissioned. My dance company is called Dance Africana. We were commissioned by Arts District Houston and Fresh Arts to do a piece around the same time I was writing this book. And it was around Brock Park. And I'm like, huh? What's that? So it's actually one of the first sites in the book. It was actually named after Richard Brock, who was up there with Jack Yates and all those people helping to establish the earliest Black schools and churches and businesses in the city. Had never heard of Richard Brock. Had never heard of Brock Park. Didn't even know First Ward had a Black community at one point. And still there, to be frank. But that was a big shocker. And of course, like I said, the book and the Lucky School, that's another one of our older Black schools that is kind of, we've unfortunately almost lost it to gentrification in the Third Ward area, and it's still there, thankfully.
The number of African Americans in the greater Third Ward has shrunk by more than 10% over the past decade. At the same time, the white population has doubled, and both education and income levels have risen, but not just because more whites are moving in.
My name is Elena Benford, and I'm an attorney.
Elena Benford is African American and a partner at a powerful Houston law firm. She and her husband moved to the McGregor area 13 years ago.
And we thought it would be nice to be in an environment at home where we were around people who looked more like we do.
I've been here for 10 years, and I still don't really know the city of Houston.
I should mention I do have a tour company. It was the book that came about and also the tour company. So Shawari Tours. So it's spelled like safari, but with a W instead of an F. But it's Shawari. It's a Yoruba word from Nigeria and Benin. It means to explore. And so it was all a part of the same when I was writing the things and all. It was the book that came about and also the tour company. So actually my first tour with my company was like literally the week before COVID. So it was in March 2020. And then I had to take a whole break and then figure out what I was going to do, re-strategize.
Yeah.
And
touring was the last thing that people wanted to do in a
pandemic. Yeah. Of course. So actually we do literally Black historical and cultural tours of the city. So we do bus tours, Black Houston bus tours, and we also do tours around the country. So we have a Philly tour, a Black Philly tour. We have an Afro-Louisiana Heritage tour, and then we also do tours to Africa. So we're going to Senegal and to Ghana. I'm also an artist that works in other genres, primarily dance. I'm a choreographer.
Oh.
You didn't know that?
We can get some dance action going up in here.
Yes.
But that's fantastic. I saw your website. It's phenomenal.
Yes. And so, thank you.
Educator, choreographer, the whole thing.
Thank you.
Wow.
Appreciate it so much. So I consider myself to be, a professor scholar. I'm also an Afrocentric entrepreneur. So I have several businesses. And I'm also what I call a conceptual diaspora artist. So basically, I'm a conceptual artist. So I work with different methods, different genres, if you will, to bring about what I want to see. And usually that's around African culture and influenced by that. And so hence the diaspora part of that. And so I primarily work as a writer and as a dancer. And so, that's my influence. Pretty much everything I do is all about connecting, empowering, and educating the Black diaspora around the world.
Sure.
The book is one of those ways.
There you go.
So,
and on some level, your podcast. I mean, I love the title.
Thank you.
Even though people may think that, Let's go to the Gumbo podcast so that we can understand how to make gumbo.
Correct.
Well, I'm sure you probably go there with recipes, but it's more than that, right?
Yes. Greetings and welcome to Gumbo the Podcast. I'm your host, Lindsay Gary. Gumbo the Podcast highlights Africa and its many manifestations from the perspective of African people globally. Focusing on culture and history, its purpose is to educate, empower, connect, and liberate the African diaspora. On today's episode, we'll be and it's actually, it's funny, when I was reaching out to people to be interviewed, they were like, oh, I don't know how to cook. Is this about food? I was like, no. But it's funny because it makes people want to know what it's about.
There you go.
But it's really about connecting, the same thing, the African diaspora worldwide.
Yes.
Looking at history and culture. I feel like gumbo is something that unites us around the world because it actually is the African word for okra. And if you look around, whether you're looking at the South, Black people here in the South, if you look at Brazilian cuisine, if you look at, Caribbean cuisine or, the cuisine eaten throughout the African continent, around with the 54, 55 countries, everybody's eating okra. And okra is an African crop. It's indigenous to Africa. And it's something that we brought with us to the Americas, like rice. So it really is a way that I feel we connect, regardless of what country we're from, what religion we are, or political standing. We're all connected through that aspect of culture. So that's why I called it gumbo. And also my family's from Louisiana, so I had to, show out for the culture there. So, yeah, gumbo. And I can cook some good gumbo, by the way.
Oh. I was just going to ask that.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
I'm so hungry now.
Me too.
I still didn't eat. But that's great.
Thank you.
Yes,
I appreciate it.
You got a lot of stuff going on.
I'm trying to keep up.
Yeah?
With everything I got going on.
Jeez. It's ICU. I'm Eddie Robinson, and we're speaking in studio with Dr. Lindsay Gary. Myself, along with a former reporter of Houston Public Media, Jen Rice, we collaborated on an investigative report, the Harris County Commissioner's Court, on the Harris County Remembrance Project. It was an effort to commemorate and recognize Harris County's 4 known lynching victims. And this project partnered with the Equal Justice Initiative that's based out in Montgomery, Alabama. And the project would work to create markers that would be installed at or around the areas where these 4 men were terrorized. And it would allow visitors, an opportunity to recognize and remember these individuals in hopes that those who view the markers would realize the continued impact, the continued effects of racial discrimination and the inequities that happen in this country and in this city. Markers, historical markers, there are very few of them here in the city. And I'm wondering, would adding markers be a good way to pay tribute to individuals, events, places, area businesses, that once thrived under Black ownership? What do you think about markers in and of itself? Should there be more markers here and around Houston?
Absolutely. Actually, the Lucky School that I brought up, I'm working on getting a historical marker there. So I mentioned in the book, I work with Miss Deborah Blacklock Sloan, who helped edit the book. And my father, actually, and Miss Michelle Barnes from Community Artists Collective, we've already submitted the application to get the historical marker at the Lucky School for that reason. I mean, you would never know that was one of the earliest Black schools in the city. And I completely agree that we need more awareness, more preservation efforts, and not just for Black sites, but especially for Black sites where there's so much anti-Black racism happening around the country and the world. We need to really work very hard to preserve those things.
Are there any sort of templates or research advice that you could offer up or pass on to other cities or other peer historians from other parts of the country who might live in cities similar to Houston, where you'd be able to share with them the do's and don'ts of what you had to endure to get a book like this published? Or if I can think of another type of question, are there or were there cities across the nation like a Chicago or a Detroit or an Atlanta, perhaps even a borough like Brooklyn, where these municipalities actually had their own sort of new red book? Are there other new red books out there?
I don't know of any, but I'm sure they exist. And if not, I encourage people to take that on. I'm actually looking to do more myself on the surrounding areas because there are so many. But I would say to encourage people that are listening, we need more documentation, more awareness, more preservation across the board for sites by people of color in general. When I launched the book, I talked about the indigenous presence. I mean, there were people here for thousands of years before anybody else came. We don't have very much documentation of those groups. Many people in Houston can't even tell you who they were. Karankawa, Akokisa, Atakapa Ishak, they can't name them. And I would love to see something done, particularly for the indigenous influence here. I would love to see a book about the Asian community, the Latino community. I think all of these people should be represented. I think this should be just the start to this happening in Houston in different ways, but also across the country and the world for that matter. I would love to see it. I can't write all the books myself. So the next person, please take that on,
Well, with the new Red Book, what's the kind of feedback that you've received from the book thus far? What are people saying?
Oh, it's been so beautiful. I just really didn't think about the end. It was just, I have to write the book and get it done. And I've been getting just a lot of praises just to finally have this void filled. And I consider myself a vessel. It's really not about me. I'm glad that I wrote it. But it's really about these ancestral voices that really didn't have a voice in the present as much as they really should have. So people have been really, really just thankful for it. I've gotten a lot of people buying it, coffee table, gifts. I would love to see the book in schools. I want this to be a part of Texas history, whether that's, in a K through 12 situation or a college. I want students to have access. I think this is something that everybody should be aware of. We should all have access. We shouldn't have to search for the history that's right at our fingertips.
What concerns about books on racial issues do you think Texas would be open to carrying in its school systems?
I think something about the new Red Book, I should say, is probably easier to swallow because of the way that it's presented. Because, there's a lot of pushback on critical race theory.
Yes.
But this deals with that, but in a way that it's centered around celebration, not challenging. Of course it challenges, but it doesn't appear like that. And hopefully I'm not giving too much away by saying it. But I think that sometimes, unfortunately, if something is outright challenging a system, it's going to be shut down immediately. We still need those outright challenges. But because my book is presented in this way of celebrating those sites, maybe people don't see it as that big of a threat, even though it may be. I think that we need more of those books to be put out there, and unfortunately they're not. And so I hope that this state will see this as something that's celebratory and in remembrance, and to increase tourism, which honestly is going to benefit the whole state, But, this is not to say that we shouldn't continue with critical race theory, because as a professor, that's extremely important, that we challenge systems. I just don't know how soon the state will be ready for that. I hope sooner than later.
Do you think there's this mindset or philosophy, especially here in Texas, that some people are willing to do anything to be able to suppress the prosperity, the richness, the innovations of what Blacks accomplished historically? I mean, you would think that people would have open arms in making this right and start reconstructing history books, adding fresh new perspectives, historical facts inside today's school textbooks and curriculum. Do you think that it's as if it's a threat of the future of success of more Blacks that might be onto something, and once they're onto something, they should be monitored or they should be restrained? And this is the perfect way to do it, is to ensure that that history of the past is not known. What is it that you think that keeps people from not wanting this history known?
I think there are two things. I think the first one is what you were describing. I always say that segregation and, the systemic racism was not just about Black people being equal. It's about Black people surpassing them. And
Interesting.
Yes, I think it was the fear that if they had equal resources, they would do better than other people. And I do think that there's a part that if we knew what people were doing in 1915 with very limited resources, as we saw in the original Red Book, if people had access and knew about that, they would be doing more. And that's what I really want to rekindle in the Black community. We could be doing so much. We can have way more sites. We can build more sites. We can preserve the ones we have and make more. And I do think there's a fear of that. I also think there's a fear of, if people know what happened in the past with the racist efforts, they're going to see that they're going to be more aware of what's happening today, because racism is still here. And I do believe that there's a fear of a way of life ending. And I believe that when we start calling out certain things, we're going to be calling out all the things. And when we call out all the things, I feel like people feel like they're going to lose power. They're going to lose control. For example, if you take down a change of street name from a Confederate soldier, and then you ask, why did you do that? Oh, we did that because he enslaved people. And then you look at the United States and think that the first president also enslaved people. Mm-hmm. I think that's scary, to think that there's a connection with those two people. And I think that instead of moving towards how do we repair it and how can we move forward with knowing that history, people try to pretend that it didn't happen. And how can we stop people from calling attention to it? So I think that it's a fear of the domino effect, really, and what that will bring. But we have to acknowledge the truth. The history is what it is. None of us were there in the past, but we have to acknowledge it and figure out ways to move forward.
Coming up, we'll continue our conversation with Dr. Lindsay Gary. She's the author of The New Red Book, a guide to 50 of Houston's Black historical and cultural sites. We'll explore aspects of how Houston's Black history was impacted by environmental racism, redlining, and real estate restrictions. Plus, there were certain spots and areas of prosperity for Blacks in Houston that the author wanted to feature in her book. But those sites are no longer there. What happened to them? An intriguing third segment of ICU comes your way right after this. We'll be right back. If you're enjoying this program, please be sure to subscribe to our podcast, ICU with Eddie Robinson. You can hear all the past episodes and be notified when new episodes are released. Also, please take a minute to give us a review or comment. We love getting feedback from our listeners.
It's ICU. I'm your host, Eddie Robinson, and we're speaking with Dr. Lindsay Gary. We're fortunate to have her in studio because she's written a book called The New Red Book, a guide to 50 of Houston's Black historical and cultural sites. This guidebook documents little-known histories of the Bayou City. For instance, the Almeda Post Office, the site of the first nonviolent civil rights demonstration in the city, even pop cultural destinations like Frenchie's Creole Kitchen and Screwed Up Records and Tapes. In The New Red Book, Dr. Gary takes readers on a rich and compelling journey through the histories of Houston, the region, and African American culture. Now, the title of the book pays tribute to the original 1915 publication called The Red Book of Houston, a compendium of social, professional, religious, education, and industrial interests of Houston's colored population. This original Red Book was something researchers labeled as one of a kind because it offered up detailed descriptions of African American success in the South during a time of social and political unrest. Dr. Gary, let's unearth this Red Book, the original one, because if we could return for a minute back to our chat earlier about the original book, to me, it's really fascinating to think that 5 or some odd years later, in the 1920s, the residential master plan community known as River Oaks here in Houston would begin its existence at that time and became known as one of the wealthiest, if not the wealthiest neighborhood in the Houston area during the 20s. How were some of the areas depicted in the Red Book destroyed? I mean, what happened? I mean, I believe I was reading about Annie Hagen, From what I read from this website here at Rice, it stated that she was a midwife who owned 2 pieces of property. She established Houston's first African-American nursing school, which I had not known about. Her neighborhood was later demolished to make way for Interstate 45 and Allen Parkway. She stayed at 609 Hobson Street. That no longer exists. But when someone says Allen Parkway, yeah, I distinctively remember that being a part of River Oaks. And I'm often wondering, did blacks ever live in that area? Prior to, those private developers that popped in and, just refurbished, if you will, that area and made it River Oaks. But I'm just kind of curious with folks like Annie Hagen. Did she live in so-called River Oaks before it was River Oaks? I mean, what happened to these neighborhoods? How were they destroyed? What went on? Because from what I gather, and if people read the Red Book of 1915, it's middle and upper class blacks really doing the damn thing.
Mm-hmm. Doing for self, for sure. I can't speak exactly to what happened there in that situation, but I do believe that there have been, unfortunately, very intentional efforts to destroy black communities. I mean, we know this. It's been documented.
Correct.
And so one instance can be if there's a prosperous situation going on. Think about Freedmanstown. I mean, that was not only one of the earliest black neighborhoods or areas in the city, but it was pretty autonomous. You know what I mean? They had everything they needed. They didn't have to, they really didn't have a choice to go to many other places, but banks. It was a center of commerce, not just, churches and schools, but a center of commerce, banks, everything, businesses. And you look at downtown and you're like, wait, what happened to Freedmanstown? You look at Fourth Ward, like, where is it? Right? I don't think that's an accident. It's mostly gone, unfortunately. I mean, I was at Antioch Church, which is also in the book, one of the oldest black churches in the city, literally built the year after emancipation in 1866. And it's surrounded by high rises. It's surrounded by huge office buildings. You wouldn't even know it was back up in there. And it was a part of that area. So I do feel like it was intentional to limit the prosperity. But I also think if you look at some of the lower income black neighborhoods, it's just a matter of like, we don't really care who's there. Let's put a highway through it, or let's put a refinery. And not just talking about Houston, but just across the country.
Sure.
We just complete disregard and environmental racism playing a role in these areas. And that's unfortunately what's happened to a lot of these sites, or not a lot of these sites, but a lot of these cities, if you will. Some of them were their own cities, like Independence Heights, but also neighborhoods.
Yeah, tell us more about Independence Heights.
Yes, so I didn't get as much as I wanted for Independence Heights in the book, but I definitely do mention it because I think it's important to know that there were these areas where they were completely autonomous, working independently of the city, and black people were running them. Because I think there's this myth that we can't do for ourselves, that we don't have the knowledge, the skills, the resources. And that was happening around the country. And so Independence Heights, unfortunately, is not really exactly what it looked like back then. But you still have some of those sites still standing, but a lot of those buildings are gone. I wanted to include more, but I also wanted the sites in the book to be places you could visit. You know what I mean? And some of them you can't visit.
Right, because they're gone.
Exactly. And so some of the sites you can't really visit, I mention them, but they're not necessarily featured as their own individual feature. And that's unfortunate. I don't want any site in this book to have that be the case in 100 years in the future.
Sure.
They should all still be here.
That's an interesting nugget there. The challenge in and of itself right there of, having to include that in the book, but they're not there anymore. Mm-hmm. I'm wondering if any of your sites caught on to the issues related to real estate mapping and redlining, and if you discovered anything in terms of the historical background as relates to that, because I feel like housing practices really hit the nail on the head for a lot of Black Americans and pushed many of them out. And did you ever find any of those kinds of instances and cases?
Yes, unfortunately I did. For some reason, that really just bothers me. And
It does to me too.
And I think it's because I grew up in Third Ward. I still live in Third Ward, and I've seen literally the transformation of Freemanstown. And so I think that there's been a lot of intentional efforts, obviously, like I've said before, to do the redistricting.
Yes.
Even thinking about the Third Ward my mom grew up in and how much different it is today. The zoning of schools, even integration that happened in the 60s. You know, my mom being forced to go to a whole different school during that period, but not really for the true reasons it was supposed to be for. There's a lot of that has happened and continues to happen. So I think my biggest thing is just making sure people are aware that, unfortunately, the things that were happening in the 1900s, the early 1900s, that were happening when these sites were founded are still happening today.
I completely agree, because on some level, many people don't necessarily believe that there's privilege, that there's white privilege. And knowing the history and having that be more accurately presented in a form where people can understand, you know what, there was some issues relating to real estate mapping and redistricting and zoning, and it all stemmed from the Great Depression. You know, there were a host of massacres. There were a host of mass killings that happened throughout our nation, and the reasoning behind those incidents matter. And so painting those kinds of histories in a way that allows anyone, regardless of your race, regardless of your ethnicity, to actually understand what happened back then, you get to understand how Black Americans feel the way they feel about police brutality, about voter suppression, about the lack of Black leadership in corporate entities. You have a better feel of understanding white privilege or privilege in general. But some people don't necessarily think that it exists, only because those histories haven't been there and they weren't there.
Right. And I think, too, going on that point, that it's not a matter of what happened in the past. It's what is actually happening today. So we understand today because we look at the history.
That's right.
But, I hear people say, oh, we just forget about it, let it go. But I'm like, it's still happening. It's not anything to forget when you're currently experiencing it. So it's like, understand the history to know the context, but also, like, just pay attention to what's happening every day. Unfortunately, some things have changed. Fortunately, some things have changed.
For sure.
But many things are still there.
That's right.
And so our ancestors' struggles are still our struggles today. Regardless of who your ancestors are, it's still the same. So I think, it's important to understand what happened so we can know what's happening today and also move forward. We have a lot to do. We have a lot to do.
It's ICU. I'm Eddie Robinson, and we're speaking in studio with Dr. Lindsay Gary. Did you ever find yourself, I would imagine you did, as you were writing the book, and perhaps you were getting a bit tired, a bit frustrated, but I don't want to get too spiritual here, but did you ever find yourself hearing voices from ancestors pushing you forward, pushing you on to say, you've got to finish this. Don't look back?
Absolutely. I mean, I'm very spiritual myself, and I know that the people who built this city, in terms of the Black founders of this city, had to be. They were. To take what they didn't have and make everything that they did have. So for me, that was what kept me going, to be frank. They kept me going. Of course, I mean, personal ancestral voices, ancestors that I came through as I was researching, they kept me going for sure. That was probably the most important aspect of my, continuing with the process.
This is your first book, Dr. Gary, and you've got history and the research bug as part of your DNA. Of all that you've accomplished as a writer, as a historian, Africologist, dance artist, educator, choreographer extraordinaire, of all that you've accomplished in life, what lessons have you learned about yourself thus far?
Well, the main lesson goes back to kind of what you were saying before and asking me before. I really move in purpose, and if it's not aligned with that, then I really don't put too much effort into it. So pretty much everything I do is, I feel like it's purpose. I feel like I'm being called to do it. And I feel like there's something deeper pushing me to continue. And once I realized that, it really weeded out all the other things and gave me a lot of clarity, a lot of focus, and a lot of perseverance to continue with whatever I really set out to do. You know, if I would have given up when they told me no and not taking it seriously, but I said, no, I know I'm supposed to be writing this book. So when they said reapply, I reapplied. I didn't have to, but I did, you know. And when they said, hey, we're starting this new program, I could have said, oh, I wanted to be an artist in residence. And I said, no, we're going to get this book done. So I think it's really about staying focused. And I think, and this is really especially the young people who may be listening.
Yes.
I know social media is fun. I enjoy it, but stop comparing yourself to everybody else. And I know social media has a lot of benefits, but a lot of what happens on social media is comparison. And that really can cloud our judgment on what we should be doing, because we're seeing what everybody else is doing, their highlights of life, and like, oh, maybe I should be doing. I don't worry about it. I barely scroll because I'm focused so much on what I'm doing that I don't want any distractions in my head, in my spirit about where I should be going. So stay focused on what you should be doing, and don't be worried. Literally, don't be like with the grandparents. Don't be worried about everybody else. Yes. That's what it boils. Like, really though, don't. Because it's really going to cloud where you should be going. Everybody has a reason and a purpose.
She's Dr. Lindsay Gary, author of The New Red Book, an interesting guidebook that puts a spotlight on 50 of Houston's Black historical and cultural sites of the region. Dr. Gary, thank you so much for being a guest on ICU.
Thank you.
Our team includes technical director Todd Holzlander, producer Laura Walker, editors Mark DeClaudio and John Mitchell Good. ICU is a production of Houston Public Media. Follow us on Instagram and Twitter, and subscribe to our podcast wherever you listen and download your favorite shows. I'm your host and executive producer, Eddie Robinson. And I feel you. We hear you. I see you. Thanks so much for listening. Until next time.